Imagine your deepest, darkest secret. Not the one you whisper to a therapist or confess in a moment of drunken weakness, but the one you've buried so deep that even you are starting to forget it ever happened. The one thing that, if brought to light, would turn your family against you, empty your bank account, and erase your name from history books as if you were never there. Now, imagine that a total stranger has that secret. He doesn't just know it, he owns it. He has the dates. He has the names. He has the bank statements, the telegrams, and the photographs you thought you burned 20 years ago. In 1928, London didn't run on gold bars, political manifestos, or the divine right of kings. It ran on shame. Shame was the invisible currency of the elite, the silent engine that powered the drawing rooms of Mayfair and the high-stakes halls of Parliament. And one man, a phantom living in the nicotine-stained shadows of a nameless back alley, owned the rights to every scandal in the British Empire. His name was Silas Thorne. For 2 decades, he was the most powerful man you've never heard of. He was the architect of silence, a man who could ruin a 300-year-old legacy with a single, strategic phone call. He was the ghost collector. But tonight, the man who spent a lifetime collecting ghosts is about to become one. This is the story of the Gilded Trap. To understand the absolute, terrifying power of Silas Thorne, you first have to understand the physical reality of his domain. It wasn't found in a gleaming skyscraper or a fortified bunker. It was in the Thorne Archive. His office in Mayfair was a windowless cathedral of paper, tucked behind a dusty antique clock shop where the rhythmic, mechanical ticking of 100 gears created a constant, heartbeat-like thrum. This sound seemed to count down the remaining seconds of 1,000 reputations. Inside that office, the walls were lined from floor to ceiling with thousands of identical black leather binders. There were no names on the spines. There were no labels to identify the victims, the dukes, the ministers, the archbishops, and the industrialists. Instead, Silas used an intricate system of numerical codes based on the London Stock Exchange coordinates of 1905, a code only he and his young apprentice, Elias, could decipher. To the outside world, Silas was a nonentity, a small, gray-suited ghost who moved through the London fog without leaving a footprint or a ripple in the social register. But to the upper echelons of British society, he was the silent, terrifying partner in every marriage contract and every corporate merger. He was the man you paid a monthly insurance premium to, just to ensure that the sun would continue to rise over your family estate. His network of invisible eyes was everywhere. Silas Thorne understood a fundamental truth about the British class system: the people at the top are entirely dependent on the people they ignore. He had the head housekeeper at the Savoy Hotel, Mabel, who saved discarded, half-burnt telegrams from the fireplaces of foreign diplomats. He had Arthur, the disgraced clerk at the Bank of England, who spent his night spotting subtle, illegal shifts in colonial ledgers for a bottle of gin. He even had the silent valets in the smoking rooms of the Reform Club, trained to be invisible, but possessing ears like owls. Silas treated these people like a grand conductor treats an orchestra, fine-tuning their betrayals until they resonated in perfect, deadly harmony with his interests. He lived in monastic simplicity, eating dry toast and drinking lukewarm tea, while surrounded by the most expensive sins of the modern world. He believed his archive was an impenetrable fortress, a sanctuary of paper that would outlast the crown itself. He was the architect of London's hidden history, believing himself untouched by the filth he traded in. But Silas had grown comfortable. He believed that because he owned the shadows, he was safe from the light. He was wrong. Let's look at Ledger 442, Admiral Julian Stirling. To the British public, Stirling was a legend, a hero of the Battle of Jutland, a man of iron will whose chest was so heavily laden with medals, the Victoria Cross, the DSO, that he walked with a permanent, dignified lean. He was the personification of naval pride, the man destined to become the first Sea Lord. But Silas Thorne held a version of the Admiral that the public was never meant to see. Ledger 442 was a record of the Admiral's nights in the hazy, blue-tinted basements of Soho, places like the Blue Parrot Cabaret, where the thick fog of the Thames met the sweet, cloying smoke of illegal opium dens. In those shadows, the Lion of the Navy was a desperate man with a gambling debt so staggering that even if the Admiral sold his ancestral estate and every heirloom within it, he would still be short of covering it. Silas's eyes, specifically a stagehand with a heroin habit and a debt of his own, had recovered a series of handwritten letters from a discarded military coat. These weren't just love letters to a young, ambitious actress in a Soho cabaret. They were financial confessions. If these letters reached the Admiralty, it wouldn't just be a scandal, it would be a court-martial. Stirling wouldn't just lose his rank, he would lose his history, his pension, and his honor. But Silas Thorne was a strategic architect. He didn't want the Admiral's money. He wanted the Admiral's soul. He wanted Stirling's vote in the high-stakes boardrooms of the Admiralty to ensure that the massive naval contracts for the next generation of high-speed destroyers were awarded to Vickers Thorne Steel, a company Silas secretly held majority shares in through a web of offshore shells in Lisbon and Zurich. For 3 years, the most decorated officer in the Royal Navy was a puppet on a silk string. Every time Admiral Stirling stood on the bridge of a battleship, he was acutely aware of the invisible man in the dusty Mayfair office. He knew that his honor, his family's 300-year legacy, and his very seat at the table of power hung by a single, fragile thread held by Silas Thorne. This was the true Thorne method, the perfect geometry of blackmail. You don't kill the victim. You keep them alive. You keep them in power. But you keep them terrified. Silas loved knowing that the hero of the nation was, in secret, a servant of the shadow. Silas Thorne understood that the most profitable secrets were those held by the men of God. Consider Ledger 1109, the Bishop of Kensington. To his congregation, he was a saintly figure who preached the virtues of poverty and the spiritual necessity of charity. But Silas's invisible eyes, specifically an elderly, quiet sexton who had worked in the cathedral for 40 years, discovered a terrifying discrepancy. The bishop wasn't spending the church's tithes on the poor of London. Instead, he was diverting vast sums to a decadent, hidden estate in the French countryside. A place of Parisian silks, expensive brandy, and sins that would have made the Borgias blush. Silas didn't expose the bishop. He didn't care about the morality of the theft. Instead, he made the bishop his primary lobbyist in the House of Lords. For 5 years, the most influential voice in the church was Silas Thorne's most faithful servant. Every time the land tax bills came up, bills that would have crippled the profits of Silas's aristocratic clients, the bishop would stand and deliver a moral argument that conveniently protected the interests of the wealthy. Silas would sit in the back row of the cathedral during Sunday service, watching the bishop preach against greed, a small, knowing smile on his face. He loved the psychological weight of it. The man who promised heaven to the masses was secretly working for the man who held the keys to his earthly hell. This was the gilded trap in its purest form, a prison of conscience where the bars were made of your own sins. Silas Thorne didn't just own their secrets, he owned their shadows. And as long as he kept the binders locked, he was the master of the empire's soul. He felt invincible, believing the silence would last forever. He didn't realize that even the most loyal servant eventually looks for a way out. If the military was Silas's sword and the church was his shield, then the treasury was his counting house. Consider Ledger 001, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. In 1924, the British economy was balanced on a razor's edge. The post-war recovery was stuttering, and the Chancellor, a man of rigid mathematical logic, had committed a fatal error, a secret, unauthorized loan from a German industrial bank to cover a massive deficit in the national budget. Had the news broken, the government would have collapsed in a single afternoon, and the Chancellor would have faced a treason trial for dealing with a former enemy. Silas's eyes in the city's clearing houses caught the scent of the transaction before the ink was even dry. Silas didn't threaten the Chancellor with a prison cell. He offered him sovereign protection. In exchange for Silas's silence, the Chancellor provided him with advance notice of every major shift in the interest rates and every planned devaluation of the pound. Silas used this insider information to build a shadow fortune within the Bank of Northern Light, a private institution he controlled through a series of offshore shells. He was no longer just a blackmailer. He was the silent architect of the British economy, a man who grew richer while the rest of the nation suffered under the weight of the coming depression. He felt invincible, a ghost who had successfully captured the sun. But he had forgotten the most basic rule of the shadow world. The sun eventually sets, and when it does, the shadows no longer belong to the man who cast them. The collapse of Silas Thorne's empire began not with a loud explosion, but with the soft, dry rustle of paper. It was a cold Tuesday night in November, the kind of night where the fog seems to freeze against the window panes. Silas was alone in his office when the red envelope was slid under his door. Inside was a photograph that defied the laws of physics. It showed his private vault, the safe hidden behind the portrait of his father, swung wide open and completely bare. Silas immediately opened the real vault. Everything was there. The binders, the ledgers, the records of the Admiral and the Chancellor. The photograph was a temporal impossibility, a snapshot of a theft that hadn't happened yet. But it wasn't a hoax, it was a psychological audit. Over the next 48 hours, the City of London turned its back on him. His informants, Mabel from the Savoy, Arthur from the bank, simply vanished. The brown envelopes from his regular subscribers stopped arriving. For the first time in 20 years, the ghost collector was the one being haunted. He was trapped in a tomb of silence, and for all his dossiers and binders, he had no information on the one person who was destroying him. On Wednesday morning, the shadow took a human form. Lady Alara Vance arrived without an appointment, her white silk dress shimmering like a shroud in the dim light of his office. She was the widow of Arthur Vance, a shipping magnate Silas had audited into a fatal heart attack a decade ago to seize control of the North Atlantic trade routes. She didn't come for revenge, she came for a final audit. She revealed that her syndicate had spent 5 years infiltrating Silas's own network. They hadn't robbed his bank, they had used his own forged authorization codes, meticulously copied over years, to donate his entire fortune to the very charities he once used for money laundering. "Your millions are gone, Silas," she whispered, her voice cold as ice. "And your signature, the thing that gave you power, is now the very thing the police are using to prove your treason." She had planted forged documents in his archive linking him to a plot to assassinate the Prime Minister. Silas Thorne, the man who owned everyone's secrets, now stood as the ultimate criminal in his own library. The final act occurred in the basement. Silas found his apprentice, Elias, feeding the black leather ledgers into a roaring furnace. The boy Silas had taken from the gutters was now burning the Empire's secrets. "You taught me that the only thing more powerful than a secret is the absence of one," Elias said, his eyes empty of loyalty. Elias had taken the photograph. Elias had sold the codes. Silas Thorne didn't wait for the police. He walked to the grand winter gala, lit the velvet curtains, and watched the world of Mayfair burn from within. Years later, in a small antique shop in Lisbon, an old man with scarred hands buys a blank white ledger. He doesn't fill it with names. He finally understood. The most dangerous secret of all is the one you tell yourself to believe you are safe. The ghost of Mayfair was dead, but the shadows were already finding a new master.